So I would like to get started with part 4 of GIS After Dark. Thank you for those that are joining us. And we have a wonderful presenter today. So I'd like to get going with this presentation just because I'm so excited to introduce him to you. So just to give you a little bit of background about GIS After Dark, perhaps this is your first time attending, or maybe you haven't been attending this whole speaker series. But the whole idea is that GIS After Dark is designed to provide an environment where we bring professional GIS folks here to talk to us. And we also bring in professional Johns Hopkins alumni and Johns Hopkins students, and just to provide a kind of a casual environment where we can learn and hear about the latest and greatest techniques that these amazing GIS professionals are doing. Just to introduce myself to folks that are new here, my name is Dr. Cassandra Hansen, and I am the program coordinator for the Environmental Sciences and Policies and the GIS program at Johns Hopkins University. And so this speaker series is sponsored by the AAP Geographic Information Program. And again, I want to welcome everyone for attending. Okay, so with that said, I would like to introduce our presenter for tonight. It is my honor to welcome Joe Milbrath, and he's the cartographer one of the cartographers at the National Parks Service. He is located or works out of Harper Ferry, West Virginia, and his maps are famous. You have seen them. These are the brochures that you have looked at for hours at end, perhaps maybe hung them on your wall as a child. These are the maps that you get when you enter the park. These are the maps that you see on the park webpage. But really, one thing that I am so impressed with his cartographic skills is that his work establishes a sense of place for those visiting these amazing parks or those that are exploring or have yet to do so. So let's go ahead and give Joe our attention. I would actually encourage you guys at this point in time, if you feel comfortable, turn on your screens. Let's see your faces. Let's see each other. And there will be an opportunity to ask questions with your own audio at the end. So at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and turn the sharing capabilities over to Joe. And so I'm going to stop sharing on my end. And Joe, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Joe Milbrath. And like Dr. Hansen said, I'm a cartographer with the National Parks Service. And yeah, I'd just first like to thank everybody for tuning in. I know we all spend a lot of time in front of our computers these days, and it's extremely appreciative that you are tuning in just for this presentation. And also thank you, Dr. Hansen, for allowing me to share some of these fun cartographic approaches with everybody here at Johns Hopkins. So before we dive into kind of some 3D mapping approaches here, I want to share a little bit of my history or my background with cartography. This is a map of a National Park Service property. It's actually of Denali National Park up in Alaska. And I made this map back in 2011 before I even started my career at the National Park Service. And this map was just a huge, learning experience and exposure to me. I was a graduate student at the University of Montana. And my instructor, Kevin McManigal, who's been a presenter in this series, was teaching this advanced cartography class, and our project was to recreate a National Park Service map. And at that time, I had essentially just been introduced to how to make maps in Adobe Illustrator. My workflow is essentially out of ArcGIS. It was even before ArcPro at the time. And so I kind of had my workflows, and Kevin kind of introduced this whole new way of working, and it just was like extremely enlightening for me to all of a sudden, have to dive into the nuances of these incredibly beautiful maps and, learn just the little intricacies that make them up. And so, I love this map, and actually looking at it now, I kind of cringe because, I've learned a lot of new things along the way, but I still do love this map. And actually, shortly after I made this, a couple years afterwards, as luck had it, a position with the National Park Service came open, and I submitted this map along with a series of others in my resume, and was offered a job as a National Park Service cartographer. So it's kind of serendipitous, and just really everything that I think of in my career comes back to, just diving into the weeds with something like this. So after I accepted this job and I moved to Harpers Ferry from Missoula, Montana, from west to east, just a total culture shock. I began working at Harpers Ferry Center in Harpers Ferry. And for those of you who have been to Harpers Ferry, probably a lot of you, if you're at Johns Hopkins, it's just down the road. If you know that Harpers Ferry Center is just this little nugget that's located up on the former Storer College campus. It's up at the kind of the top of the map here, and actually HFC is just beyond the edges of it. But part of my my new position there was a recent graduate job, so I actually studied under Tom Patterson for the first year, and he mentored me throughout that first year. And I mean, in my mind, he's the person behind the National Park Service maps. He put in 30 plus years and really developed a lot of the most beautiful maps that you see out there. So it was just an incredible opportunity to work under him. And a lot of his maps are going to be sprinkled throughout this presentation. So for those of you who don't know, Harpers Ferry Center is the interpretive design center for the National Park Service. So along with cartography, the center develops National Park Service films, visitor center exhibits, waysides, publications, mobile apps, essentially all of the interpretive media for the National Park Service. And maps play a vital role in that broad array of interpretive media. And all of these products have their own way of interacting with the user. A majority of my work is working on the Unigrid brochures. So when you pay, the friendly ranger at the toll booth your fee, and you go into a park and they hand you a brochure, I work on the maps that go there. And then a lot of my work also goes into working on exhibit maps and mobile apps and all these other broad approaches here. So when most people think about the national parks, they think of Yellowstone and Yosemite and Great Smoky Mountains, but the NPS actually oversees, at this point, it's 423 park units. And those include national monuments and battlefields, preserves, historical sites. It's just the designations go on and on. But the entire National Park Service system is just incredibly immense. It spans 11 time zones and reaches from the Arctic Circle all the way down to actually below the equator. And with parks spread across such a large geographic area, there was a need to develop some consistency through a visual identity throughout the National Park Service. So in the late 1970s, NPS maps kind of began to establish some key map design elements that actually still remain today. And the use of these little black symbols that we call pictographs were developed to point visitors to services and amenities. The green filled areas distinguish parks from their surroundings. And for years, these kind of stock national park maps were ubiquitous throughout the entire system. And today, some of these same design concepts remain. And I'll actually start out here with just illustrating some really basic elements that go into an NPS map. And I'll illustrate them through this really kind of simple map of Sunset Crater National Monument. So one of the most important elements is clean map design lies within the font and labeling of your map. So in 2001, the NPS switched from a Helvetica font to Frutiger, which is a sans serif typeface designed to be legible at distances and also in really small text sizes, which is certainly something that comes into play with our maps. And it also is, Frutiger offers an arrangement of weights, so it allows you to build this visual hierarchy in just the labels alone. You'll notice that we have these bolded trails that indicate campground labels and trail labels. We have bright green callouts for the visitor centers, and these attract the reader to the main points of interest in the map. And to create a clean appearance, the stacked labels are all aligned to the feature that they're calling out. One nice thing too with being kind of using Frutiger as our standard font is you don't have to cycle through, these hundreds of different styles and choose, which ones you want to go through. So it's kind of nice to have this limitation here that we use Frutiger. And I think we all know, if you're using GIS or into cartography, we know that data is pretty plentiful these days, and our maps can turn into a complete bowl of spaghetti if we don't selectively clean things up. And so on National Park Service maps, the information that we don't show is just as equally as important as the information that is on the map. To reduce clutter, we don't show service roads, maintenance buildings, staff housing, sensitive information such as archaeological sites or the location of endangered plants. And then we take polygons and polylines here, and we simplify them either in Map Publisher, which is a geospatial plugin that we use, or mapshaper.org is a fantastic website that will simplify shapefiles. And we just use that to kind of reduce any extraneous details that might just be too complex to be displayed clearly, and just generate these really nice flowing lines and just kind of clean things up in general. And it really does do a lot to your maps. This map also shows a newer approach to highlighting the park area. So instead of this green fill, we have a thin green line and then just this really soft green vignette that suggests the park boundary, but it still allows the terrain and relief to appear to show the landscape. And while we adhere to these basic design principles, our national parks depict just a diverse array of landscapes. And so it allows us to show glaciers, to move into deserts, to coral reefs, to urban areas, or volcanic islands, and historic sites like this map of Eleanor Roosevelt Valkyl's home. It's depicted with realistic 3D software. So now that we've kind of lightly treaded on the basic foundations of NPS maps, I want to dive into some fun approaches that I really enjoy, is mapping parks in 3D. So 3D maps, oblique views, panoramas, I'll kind of use these terms interchangeably, but they can take on a variety of appearances and functionality. And they're incredible tools that can connect visitors to a place that may not be accessible. Here at Katmai National Park and Preserve, most visitors flock to Brooks Camp, which is kind of the most popular site to go see bears feasting on salmon in these waterfalls. It's pretty iconic. But few visitors actually get to the very remote stretches of this really sprawling place. And so a 3D oblique map like this can kind of give the visitor at least a bird's eye view of how massive and how wild this place is. Another example that 3D maps really shine are this example of Exit Glacier that illustrates to map readers that you've got a long slog to get all the way up to the Harding ice field. They can also be used for thematic diagrams. This is a diagram that illustrates the geologic processes of Crater Lake National Park. Or to depict a historic event, like this map of an attack at Black Kettle's camp at what's now Washita Battlefield National Historic Site in Oklahoma. And not all 3D maps need to have a raster terrain. So this vector map of the south rim of the Grand Canyon is especially unique. You'll probably notice that there's this massive lens over the map that says enlarged area, map not to scale. This map was designed for kind of the typical visitor to the Grand Canyon that only spends 2 hours at the park. Imagine that. You go to the Grand Canyon, you spend 2 hours there. But we needed to fill this use. And so we created this guide that could get them to the rim and include all the major services, amenities, and bike routes. And then we added these cool little 3D buildings. And all of these were designed in Adobe Illustrator. So these little buildings actually have a pretty special place in my heart because it was actually the first project I worked on as a National Park Service cartographer. And here I think I'm going to be mapping, these grand parks like, I guess like the Grand Canyon, but here all of a sudden I'm diving into just these 3D buildings of it. But actually it was a really great tool to learn all of the different aspects of Adobe Illustrator and all the little functions that you can use to create these nice little vector shapes. And actually distilling reality into these small recognizable forms was quite the challenge. Actually, half of these buildings actually on the printed map were smaller than the size of my pinky nail. So you're just kind of really encapsulating a lot of information into a really small amount of space. So to make these, they were created just by looking at aerial imagery that was available. The park shared some photographs that they had. We dove into a lot of actual just Google Street View and just kind of did this little scavenger hunt to get any shapes that we could to distill them into this kind of little recognizable form. And then we placed them into the layout. And you'll notice that they're also cased with these black lines, and that kind of just helped them, cement themselves into the layout. It kind of goes really well with the heavy bolded type. But once we had all of these 19 3D buildings added into the layout, we added, all the rest of the content and adding just this hierarchy of labels, to fit into the layout and smoothing the lines. It really turned out well, and it was quite a fun little project to work on. A similar style map is this walking tour map of Salem Maritime, and it actually has the kind of the three-dimensionality to it. But this map, all the roads, all the building footprints, and the boundaries are all georeferenced. So this was created on a planimetric base map. And the base map was created in Adobe Illustrator using a geospatial plugin, Map Publisher. And this map is completely geospatial, so you can upload it to your phone and navigate through this thing while it still has these fun little 3D buildings. So now, while vector buildings are fun and a nice way to spruce up a planimetric map, my true cartographic passions are in mapping mountains. And so I think we'll move on to raster approaches for depicting terrain from here on out. This is a high oblique view. It's kind of a nice hybrid of a planimetric map and with a little slight oblique angle to it of Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park. And the oblique angle here did a couple of things. It actually made it really nice to actually kind of condense the foreshortening of the map, so it kind of constricted a little bit vertically, so it wasn't so long, and it also helped raise the peaks up a little bit and show the depth of some of these canyons. Another cool technique that we use to enhance terrain is called planimetric oblique rendering. And here you can just see kind of a standard conventional shaded relief. This was created from a digital elevation model, and this is of the Teton Range. And planimetric oblique relief applies vertical offset to the terrain while maintaining the spatial dimensions of the map. So the 3D terrain is much easier to read, and it really makes the Tetons kind of do what they know what to do, is stand up and be really beautiful. We use these planimetric oblique reliefs for kind of larger wall maps that are displayed in visitor centers. And I know what you're thinking, like, these are beautiful. Why don't all Park Service maps go into these 3D styles? But there's a few really key things that you need to figure out before you dive into a 3D map, and we'll run through a few of those right now. So I've gleaned this list from Tom Patterson's shadedrelief.com making 3D maps tutorial, which, if any of this piques your interest, I highly recommend going and looking at that tutorial, because it has like 30 some chapters and it's extremely detailed. But we'll go over some of the key points of it in this presentation. So the first thing is time. To produce a 3D map takes a lot longer than a standard map. There are seemingly endless variables to consider and experiment with to get a desired outcome. And you'll first need to create a georeference base map before even venturing into a 3D version. This is Whitman Mission National Historic Site. And this was kind of just this base map that I've made to start out. And these are all the vector layers that I'll need to then overlay into my 3D software of choice when you get to that point. So this is the later 3D rendering that I've made mostly in a program called Natural Scene Designer, and then using Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator to do a lot of the touch-ups and then map work. But of course, with all that extra time of creating a 2D map and then bringing it into 3D, it just means the cost of the project goes up. Data is also a major consideration. 3D mapping is really not possible without essential data, including digital elevation models and aerial imagery. High resolution DEMs might be required to make that really large scale, beautiful scene that your client wants. And sometimes there are critical satellite images that are full of clouds or smoke, like the one in the middle here, or that high resolution image of some mountainous terrain is still covered in snow, and you need to show some nice hiking trails on it. International boundaries can also hinder 3D mapping efforts. So this is a test render for Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. And, not surprisingly, the National Land Cover dataset coverage ends at the Canadian border. So I'm kind of out of luck here, and I need to go and find, another data set that will cover Waterton and then the surrounding Canadian Rockies. So it just adds to the amount of effort involved. 3D maps can also require vast data coverages beyond the area that you want to highlight, especially if you choose that you want to include a cool horizon and sky like this map of Katmai. So if you can see Katmai National Park here, the boundaries cover about the 2/3 of the map, the foreground and midground. But then there's this background third that spans nearly 400 miles into the distance. So in order to cover all that area, you need a lot more data. And with all that data comes more time of gathering it, processing it, and then render times can just explode with some of these. And some terrain is not entirely suited for a 3D map. I have an example here of Kenai Fjords National Park, and Alaska's terrain is actually optimal. I'm showing a pretty good example here. And that's because it's so expansive and it's unpopulated. You don't have a lot of disturbance on the landscape. You can just map what's naturally there. But in some of these wild places, terrain can be a little too complex, and important features are just hidden no matter what viewing angle you kind of look for within it. So you want to make sure that your geography fits kind of your idea of what you want to work with there. So once your data is rendered in the 3D map, it loses all georeferencing. At HFC, all of our planimetric maps are geospatially aware, and they're all available for download on the Avenza Map Store. And so if your client is looking for a map that they want to navigate, using a mobile device, a 3D map probably isn't the best option. And then finally, the last limitation we'll talk about here is foreshortening. And I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but due to oblique viewing angles of 3D maps, the vertical extent of a map is shortened. So this can cram a lot of information into a really small amount of space. And elements, and this example of Dinosaur Monument, it shows that the majority of the foreground here is actually non-park related. And then you have the midground, which is the park, is squeezed into a tight space. You're losing the main content of the map, which are the Yampa River and the Green River. And then in the background, you have these stunning, beautiful mountains, but they're outside of the park. So sometimes your vision just doesn't work out, unfortunately. But there's always time to try again. And with this one, Tom Patterson recreated that old map using a plan oblique rendering of the park, and you can see the foreshortening kind of was resolved here, and now we can actually see these previously occluded stretches of the Yampa and the Green Rivers. All right, so enough of what's going to stop you from doing these things. Let's jump into how to go about setting them up and the next steps to create a really cool scene. So once you've weighed all those options, you need to first just go ahead and set up a scene. This early phase of the project is extremely vital and will have an impact on how your overall map will look. So direction of view, camera height, pitch, vertical exaggeration, light angle, sky, no sky. I mean, the limits or the options here are completely limitless, and you can just go to your heart's content with it. But at this point, I will do a search, find the best available data for whatever area you're looking to map, and then I'll overlay some of the most important data on top of a DEM, a natural scene designer, to see if any of these shape files are occluded in a way that might inhibit some of this key information from showing. And then I'll play around with angles to find a composition that incorporates all that information and the most important information into the midground and the foregrounds of the view, with less vital information in the background. Then I'll render a handful of different viewing angles to share with a client. And at this point, we really want to hone in on the best angle and where we're going to move from here. It's incredibly important to settle at a viewing angle at this point, because any small tweaks, say the direction of view in the later stages, would basically mean starting over. So lighting can also have a profound effect on the feel of your map. Light direction and elevation angle can make your map look either bright and inviting or dark and drab. This north-oriented view of Glacier National Park shows the effects of lighting at various angles. So for a north-oriented view, light coming in from the southwest or the southeast have the best results. But if your map is, say, pointing to the northwest, you might have to just experiment with the best light sources. But I've always found, you don't want these cast shadows on the hillsides that are, looking at the reader. So Natural Scene Designer allows you to plant trees in this little 3D menu on your screen. And the options are a little limited, but they're still fun to work with. So you have oak, palm, redwood, and sweet gum. And these trees don't really hold up at really large scales, so I would be cautious with that. But I've found actually the oak represents a really nice deciduous tree, and oddly, the sweet gum is a nice alternative to the conifer. On top here, I have a redwood, and they just look a little scrawny and they're a little too pointy. But it's nice though, because you can alter the color, the density, the size, the leaf coverage, and the elevation extent to these things. So we'll often add them to our maps, and this is an example of Grand Teton National Park. And these 3D trees, while they're really small, just add a nice texture to the map, so it gives it a little more dimensionality. This is another example at Russell Cave National Monument in northern Alabama. And this park is almost exclusively forested, so depicting trees in the map kind of gives a reader a true sense of what the landscape will look like and what to expect while they're there. And in large scale scenes, trees can kind of make your map more realistic and inviting, like this example of Whitman Mission National Historic Site. And this render also includes a NAIP image that's kind of draped on the landscape. And the trees are actually planted where they actually reside on the true landscape. So to plant these trees, I'll go over a really quick little demo here, but planting these trees in Natural Scene Designer is actually quite easy. You just import one of these NAIP images, but actually making them look good can be a little tedious, and I'll show you why. So first, I'll select a forested spot in the NAIP image, and and each one of those little pixels will represent where a tree goes, and it works quite well. And the interface looks a little dated, but it's pretty cool and pretty amazing how well this thing actually turns out. But the issue with a lot of these is when you plant your trees and then you want to overlay an aerial image on top of your DEM, you'll see these baked in tree formations and the shadows that's still within the imagery. So including some of that in your map, it might conflict, how your shadows actually appear on the map, and it can just look a little cluttered and dark in places. So after I've created that tree map, like I showed in the previous slide, I'll actually go into Photoshop, and using the clone stamp tool, which is a really handy tool if you know Photoshop, I'll go in and I'll remove all the trees and the shadows from the aerial image. And then I'll plant my trees and drape this on the landscape instead. And so all you're seeing then are the actual trees, the cast shadows that are rendered in the 3D software on top of this kind of smoothed out aerial image. Looks pretty nice. And then after I've got them kind of situated, I'll go in and make sure that none of these trees are occluding, key trail junctions or other points of interest that might need to be shown. So I'll actually sometimes just, create a little trench of where these trees are actually planted. One really fun way to spruce up your map is by adding little tiny embellishments, and this can really give your map some fun character. In the top corner here, I have like a little volcanic plume, and then there's some little coastal wave breaks and some sun glinting off the water. All of these are created by just using the brush tool in Photoshop and just adding minor little touches that really elevate your map. On the bottom here, these sun glints and little glacial sediments in the Illiok Arm kind of attract your eye to Brooks Camp. And, that's where a majority of the people that are visiting are going. And so it's kind of a nice way to draw the visitor's eye in, while also just making this landscape way more dynamic. And if you look really closely, there's a nice little Easter egg in this bottom one too. There's a little beaver float plane that's red and white, if you can see that flying above the landscape. Let's see if you can see my mouse there. So I'll use the remainder of my time to walk through the development of how to make a 3D map. And this is all done. I'll show you the Photoshop steps and go through it a little quickly, but hopefully if there's some questions, I can answer them at the end. But this was the previous map of Cedar Breaks National Monument. And, it served its purpose. It was in circulation for quite a while, but, I really didn't feel like it captured this. And so after running through my checklist of reasons not to make a 3D map, I thought, all right, I'm going to give this one a shot. And so I gathered all the data, set up the scenes, got approval from the park to move forward with it. And I was able to get to cobble together, a pretty nice looking map that I'm pretty happy with. So I'll go ahead and show you kind of some overall steps of how I made it. So I use Natural Scene Designer, but there's plenty of other 3D mapping softwares out there to make any of these little layers. But I have a shaded relief, a terrain texture shader layer, which is open source. It's out there somewhere, and it's also in the newest Natural Scene Designer program. Rendering with NAIP draped over it, and then that tree rendering that I showed you earlier. And then I also used a height mask and slope mask, but you can get by without those. And so here's the finished relief art with my layers in Photoshop on the side. And I'll start at the bottom and kind of work my way up from there and walk through it. So I always start with a rendered shaded relief, and this is actually a blended relief of Lidar that was available for the park. And then around the edges, it has this 10-meter blended DEM, and there's a easy way to mosaic those in Natural Scene Designer, and I think you could probably do it in Arc Pro too. So I'll start with this shaded relief. And then I actually didn't use the relief within the actual map here, but I did use it to isolate the highlights and shadows. And this is a technique that's well documented at shadedrelief.com. But here I have two separate layers of shadows and highlights, one rendered at a really high resolution, and that's kind of to show the detailed hoodoos and things. And then I also have a second downsampled 30-meter resolution version of these highlights and shadows. And those are just to kind of show these nice overall brush strokes of the terrain. So now I'm going to turn those layers off and start back from the bottom. So to start, I use a 10% gray fill, just a full clean palette. And then I added my terrain texture shade layer and set the opacity to 75%. And that already looks pretty nice. Then I'll add that rendered NAIP image on top. And then I actually have a second NAIP layer with just a little bit of bump mapping on it. That's just to add a little bit more texture. But I use just a few other adjustment layers that if you start to get into the weeds with Photoshop are hard to avoid. I have a little bit of added contrast, some lightening of the rocks, add a little bit of more saturation, and then tweak the color of the green forest. Those are what all these little adjustment layers indicate. And then I added this tree map just that I rendered in Natural Scene Designer. And this tree map is set to 40% opacity, and it just gives a little bit of texturing of the forests and kind of builds it up to so it's not so flat. And then on top of that, I added just a little more saturation again to the breaks area using a masked version of that NAIP image, and just set that layer to a linear burn of 40%. Then I imported some vector layers directly from Photoshop to mark the surrounding national forests and wilderness areas. And these kind of just separate the other administrative areas from the monument. They're set to 35% opacity. And then I added just another little touch up. I can avoid some of these sometimes, but a little touch up just to enhance some of the rock striations on these vertically stretched areas. After that, I added another vector layer of all the hydrography for the area. So you can see all the rivers and streams coming into play. Those just came over from a vector layer in Illustrator. And then I used a soft drop shadow and embossment effect from the effects menu just to kind of set them into the landscape a little bit. And then I used one more adjustment layer, of course, just to tweak the color a little bit to lighten the blue. All right, and then this is where it really starts to sing. Adding that lighting again, it really just makes the terrain pop, I think. So I have the shadows set pretty low at like 20 to 25%. And the highlights are a little higher at like 50 to 60%. This really illuminates the sunny slopes and then adds a ton of depth to this complex series of ridges and valleys. And you can see, you know, it's looking really good within the breaks themselves and down into the bottom left of your map, but there is quite a bit of busyness on the peripheries. So I just ended up plopping in this non-park white layer to just de-emphasize everything around it, and it just makes your focus, you know, go straight to the park. And since this is, you know, made for park visitors, that's the emphasis that we want to show. So when I'm done with a relief like this, I'll then bring it back into Adobe Illustrator and then place all the vector components, all the labels, the trails, the symbols, and, you know, go about the same, you know, visual hierarchy that we went over a little bit before in the early parts of this talk, until I'm happy with the overall presentation. And, you know, I think this one is, it's definitely an improvement from the previous map. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So then finally, once, you know, all of these maps go to print and they're in circulation, we upload everything to our National Parks Service Carto site. And this site is open to the entire public. Anyone can go in and download these files, and we provide JPEGs, PDFs, and the actual Illustrator and Photoshop production files for the public to use. And we also include all of our symbols, nice Illustrator starter maps that will allow you just to easily style your map to look like a National Park Service map. And there's a tremendous amount of resources here. So that URL is right there in the bottom part of your screen. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And thank you so much again for allowing me to be a part of the GIS After Dark series. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Joe. That was fabulous. I have to tell you that when you get to the part where you're sharing your final product, there's just this sense of just relief of like greatness, of this cartographic, you've reached your cartographic convention, and now your eye just gets lost in the beauty of the map, and it just really pulls you in. And I thank you so much for walking us through those steps. That was just beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I would like to open up the floor to questions. And so if anyone has a question, I would encourage you to unmute yourself. And if possible, it'd be nice to see a face. So if you want to turn on your video, you're more than welcome to do so. So let's, if you have any questions for Joe, let's ask him now.
I have a question. I'm curious, Joe, if you have any evaluation process in your process to see how the public receives the map that you created.
Well, that's a great question. We, in the kind of creation of these maps, we certainly circulate it throughout our office and through other cartographers and through park staff, but we don't get public input until it's printed. But then after it's in circulation, usually the parks have the opportunity every year to submit changes that they want to see, whether it's, a campground is closed, or, this isn't really working. We're getting a lot of comments about this area of the map, and we need some clarity here. So usually about every year, we'll go through and tweak some of these things, but we definitely try to get it right the first time. Since there are 423 park units, there is no shortage of work. So yeah, but it is always good to see feedback. And I always, whenever I visit parks, I always kind of look to see how they're using the map. And but yeah, that's
Thank you.
Question. Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? So I had a question for you, Joe. How often do you get to visit these parks, and is it part of your workflow in creating the map, the end product?
Yeah, good question. It is. So we are afforded the opportunity to go to the parks when we start what's called a new brochure. So the lifespan of these brochures is typically about 5 to 10. Sometimes it's 20 to 30. I'm actually working on a project now where the map has been used for like the last 30 years. But anytime we're starting from scratch, and that includes, writing all the interpretive material in the brochure as well, we go to the parks to basically immerse ourselves there. And it's just incredibly valuable to go and feel and see the place, to then, know how to transfer that information onto the brochure and onto the map too. That's why I love making these 3D maps, because I get that inspiration from being in the landscape. But unfortunately, in these times, in COVID times, we aren't able to travel. And I'm working on a project right now in Alaska that I really wish I could get up to, but it's not going to happen, at least not right now. So,
yeah.
Hi. Have your maps been used to track environmental changes over time?
Yeah, well, we are always updating our maps with data, with like up-to-date data. So recently we just updated the Wrangell St. Elias map, and we had to go actually and measure or re-digitize the glaciers on our own because they're changing so rapidly. And we certainly rely on the parks for most of that data and most of the analysis. I think a lot of our maps are actually generalized enough where I would kind of hesitate to use as an analytic point, because we're basically catering these maps towards park visitors and not scientists or analysis. But we work with park GIS staff, and and the, the scientific community to make sure what we're getting is the most accurate data.
Great question. Any other questions?
Yeah. Hey, Joe, this is actually my first real experience learning anything about GIS, so I feel like I got a lucky break.
Cool.
This is a great start. And I have a little bit of a two-part question, I guess. Dr. Hansen mentioned at the beginning the creation of sense of place, and so obviously that's something you're balancing when you're creating these maps, the need to portray lots of information, but also to create a real a feel that you are someone looking at the map is in the space that it's depicting. And I was wondering if you have any sort of broad frameworks that you bring to thinking about a map layout to specifically create that sense of place. And then I was also wondering how that is different maybe for creating a brochure versus creating a wayside plaque or like a digital map.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. For these brochures and the maps, we're, as the cartographer, just one piece of the puzzle. I work with a writer and a graphic designer, and we kind of work together to really bring out that sense of place within the brochures that people are reading. And and I guess it all kind of depends on the intent, and sometimes park staff, they'd rather show administrative boundaries. They'd rather show that if it's in an urban area, that the park boundary ends here and this is a completely different jurisdiction outside of it. So that's the message that they're looking to send, while a lot of the examples I showed here are of these really wild, beautiful places that you can really tease out a lot of the sense of place of being there but not being able to get there. And I guess the same thing kind of goes with waysides. Waysides have a little different approach because they're fixed in the landscape. They're set where they're set, and they're the motive around a lot of those is kind of trying to describe what you're looking at in something that's not blocking the way, but it's there for you in case you want to read it and get more information about that landscape or that battle or whatever happened that may no longer be there. So it's a tricky question, and I mean, my background's in geography, but I worked in some cultural sides of the field, and then did a lot of remote sensing work and more of the physical geography side. So I kind of like to see both sides of things, and telling the story accurately, and when we can do that with maps is really, really important and effective.
Absolutely. Is there any other questions?
Hey, Joe. Thanks for the presentation. I'm interested on your thoughts on your experience. There's no doubt you have artistic skill. Did you walk off your college campus with that skill, or did it take a couple years to dial that in?
It definitely took some training. Yeah. And I've always been somebody, like a lot of geographers, just love maps, and you pore over them. I've been poring over them my whole life. And so you kind of just are influenced in ways you don't really maybe take for granted at the time. And so I've always had an interest in the arts. I'd make pottery and paint and draw. But this kind of took a different level of artistic abilities, because you're not, and it took me a little while to learn how to transfer that into kind of this digital framework of, Photoshop. I've been used to painting on canvas, but to do it on a computer screen is kind of a whole different entity. So it took a while to really get comfortable. And then, I think over time you just learn from things that maybe didn't work as well, and you just kind of gradually grow and figure it out along the way.
Great question.
Practice. Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
I actually had a question. Do you have a background in any kind of computer work or computer science, or were the software something that you kind of picked up on working with along the way?
So I have a master's in geography. So I was very familiar with like GIS coming out of grad school, and a lot of actually the remote sensing kind of specific tools. But I actually, since then, I dabbled with Illustrator in graduate school within this class, but that was kind of my first exposure to it. And then starting this job was just a complete immersion in Photoshop. And so I kind of learned on the job, which was intimidating and a little scary, but also just really fun to just play around and see what's out there. And then you just gradually, learn the software, learn its capabilities, and then learn how to maybe stretch it to the edges or just learn at different ways that you can get it to work for you. So, thinking of how, okay, I'm going to import a DEM into Photoshop and then use it as a mask instead of, something that renders heights, and then you can isolate higher elevations, and just cool ways of kind of rethinking what's possible.
I have one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
I have an environmental science background, more geology due to earth science, and that's my undergrad. I'm working on my master's right now, but with the background in military, I've worked with radar and charts and navigation and a whole host of softwares and ECDIS and RENS, all kind of stuff. I love environmental science, but I've always been intrigued with maps from 20 years ago, having worked with them in the Navy. What advice can you give for someone who wants to move from environmental science and to use GIS more in that industry where they're really not, there are not many opportunities?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think having any skill sets, especially, these really dialed in expertises in GIS, I mean, that's always going to be a benefit towards whatever profession you go into. So if you can market yourself as, I know how to make maps, and, I have this experience with GIS. I mean, there are amazing tools and tutorials out there just that can walk you through some of these, how to just do the basics. And, honestly, I think any nonprofit out there or any of these environmental entities, if you can make a map, you're gold. Like, they love having that skill to be able to transfer and show that information, whether it's, to depict, some environmental degradation or anything that's happening on the landscape. If you can depict that information and do it clearly on a map, that can tell, a million words right there. And so I would just, continue to hone your skills, and it's, Dr. Hansen teaches a cartography class in the fall that if you can get in on that, I would highly recommend just, learning the difference between cartography and GIS, because there is, the cartography is kind of the artistic side of it, and it really gives you the tools to then display these important messages.
Absolutely. I was going to jump in and say, being able to couple your background with the environmental science and what you're using with the Lidar and radar, and, being able to put that into a GIS platform and then provide additional analytics to it, and then also apply cartographic convention. That's really where it comes in, and making sure that the information that you're displaying is understood by the audience in which you're making it for. And that's like the next level of map making, is that complicated information can be digested and displayed in a beautiful form, in the sense of cartography. I mean, the definition is the art and science behind map making. So as Joe mentioned, I teach cartography every fall. Please take my class. I would love to teach you the amazing field of cartography. I mean, we could talk about symbology for weeks on end, and shades and all those wonderful things. Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have time for one more question, and then I have a poll for the group, and then a quick survey, so you guys can't leave yet. Is there any more questions?
I just wanted to say thank you for the great presentation.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Can we go ahead and just give a virtual clap to Joe? Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you spending your time and tuning in. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so I would like to get just an overview of the group. For those attending your first time, perhaps you've attended all of the sessions so far. Do we like this? Do we want to keep presenting this? Do we want to keep having professionals come speak to us? Do we like this kind of interface where it's kind of casual questions? Okay, I'm liking this. I'm liking yes, 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 because I love bringing folks to share what they're doing. And I love reaching out to Johns Hopkins alumni and bringing them back and hearing all the wonderful things. So, okay, perfect. So we will keep on with that. We also have a survey which will launch in the chat window. As you guys have connections or have ideas, I would like to hear where you would like me to take this GIS After Dark. This is an opportunity for you guys to let me know, areas of interest that you would like to for me to pursue, and I can research or reach out to our alumni in those fields. Special interests that you may have. So I'll go ahead and let you guys look at those that chat that Tasha has pasted for you. It just takes a couple minutes. With that said, I do want to promote our next month's speaker. So mark your calendar for March 4th. We have Ian McCubbin, and he is the systems engineer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And he's one of the key members on the Oceans Melting Greenland mission by NASA, which is an acronym for OMG, so mission OMG. And Ian will be sharing the geospatial approach to the mission and how they're conducting research and how the data of sending thermal probes within the ice sheet of Greenland and how they're taking that information and visualizing this dynamic changing ice sheet, this phenomenon of melting ice and how that is going to impact Greenland. So he'll be speaking next month and incorporating what he does with remote sensing to the data that they're collecting in the ice sheets to how are they visually seeing it. So I would definitely recommend you guys to mark that in your calendar and please join. With that said, Joe, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. And thank you everyone for being here. And that was just a wonderful presentation. So thank you. And I hope you guys have a wonderful evening and that the semester has been third week in the semester, that you're having a wonderful time or soon to be third week. And please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on there. I've also provided a tiny URL for the up and coming speakers so you can see kind of where we are at. And yeah, thank you very much for attending. So have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.